to the VC firms, to the startups. It's really one giant ecosystem.
I mean, but there are people who will tell you that there's no difference between a man's brain and a woman's brain.
I have had more male mentors than female mentors, simply because if you look around at who are in leadership roles, it still does tend to be men, right? No matter if you are female, male, non-binary, or however you identify yourself, if you have the talent that they need, right, there's an opportunity.
You and I were marooned on an island or something, you know, your gender would be of no interest.
Welcome to Venture Ahead. It's a series of podcasts recorded by IU University. These were recorded in Porto Alegre in Brazil at the 4th edition of the South Summit. We got to speak to people who had done keynotes, former IE students. We got to speak to people who were on panels, people that we just met and found interesting. Do this at each of the South Summit because it's a great opportunity to talk to some of the people. So thank you for getting this far. Listen to the end and let us know what you think.
Hi there, this is Joe Haslam. I'm professor at IE Business School and we're here at South Summit Porto Alegre in beautiful Brazil. And I'm here with Nancy. Good morning, Nancy.
Hi there, Joe. Thanks so much for having me on the podcast.
Absolute pleasure. Okay, so you're here to keynote. So talk to me about your keynote.
Yeah, absolutely. So yesterday had the absolute pleasure of talking to folks at Arena Stage on a topic that's been near and dear to me throughout my entire career and probably will be through the rest of my career, which is how to increase the percentage and representation of more women in deep tech, but also in leadership roles, visible leadership roles in deep tech, and why it's so important, right? So typically what I talk about is this, idea of diversity, inclusion, equity follows three processes, right? So being an engineer, business person, right? I think in frameworks and processes. One is awareness. I certainly think that we are there, right? People are aware of the problem. You don't need to take my word for it. If you look on stats online, right? Less than 3 out of 10 people in deep tech, and that includes AI, ML, robotics, cybersecurity. I happen to be in cybersecurity, have been over the past decade plus, right? Less than 3 out of 10 people are women. So I think we're already aware, right? But if we move on to steps 2 and 3, which are activation, right? And also then network building, right? We're partly there through activation because people now are aware that, hey, there's a problem. We should probably do something about that problem, right? But 3 really around how do we get started, right? So a lot of questions that I got after my keynote from the audience were about, well, what steps should I do? And actually, most importantly, right, as part of the solution, if I'm a male, right, a male ally, how can I be part of this movement, right? Because it's not just a woman problem. I mean, males are also 50% of the entire world's population, right? They need to also be part of the solution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. We had Eric in here from Dell who was talking about things from an LGBT perspective, and they were exactly the same questions. He had people coming up to him and saying, I want to be an ally, but I'm awkward about that first question.
Yeah,
You know,
that's because you can seem disingenuous to your point, right? I'm a male, maybe I'm not empathetic to the problem, but if you make it just a woman's problem and there are not that many women in leadership roles to begin with, then you're really looking at a small task force solving a much, much larger problem.
yeah. But he was saying like there's a lot of people that he's got to know like later, and then they talked about the time they first met him, and they said, yeah, years ago I heard you, but I wanted to go up and sort of see how I could help, but I didn't want to be awkward. I didn't want to say I didn't, I. The story he told me was that they were worried by defining him just as as a gay man, and that some people just don't want to be defined by that. That's just what I happen, that's just who I am in life. But they much prefer to be asked about storage vectors and, or referential integrity or something like, they much prefer to be asked by those kind of things rather than, oh, here's Eric, let's sort of try and show that I'm empathetic to the gay community.
Yeah, I align with that because, and this is why I think, demonstrating or walking the walk is so important because, a lot of now we're experiencing this DEI backlash, right? In the US, you might have heard that race-based admissions was struck down by the Supreme Court
Hmm.
last year. And it's really part of this, oh, did someone get into the role simply because they are a woman or a minority or LGBT, et cetera, right? So the best way to dispel some of that is to be a stellar example in your field. So, for example, a lot of my colleagues are women executives who are truly trailblazers in robotics AI. They're leading, AI labs at Stanford, MIT, right? They're now starting companies or they're, well-known investors, for example, Sarah Guo in the AI field, who are investing in AI companies, right? And that's the best way to demonstrate, well, I'm really good at my job. I'm a stellar example. And oh, I happen to also identify as a female.
Sure. I mean, but there are people who will tell you that there's no difference between a man's brain and a woman's brain. I mean, I don't know the question to that. It's
Yeah.
not my field. But I mean, I guess tend to sort of say they do say things like that women multitask better and things like that. I mean, is that something you've thought about?
So I've had the pleasure of hiring and building, large organizations within companies like Google and Amazon. And certainly, right, in every, I would say, subgroup, you find maybe themes, right? But that's like saying, all Europeans are good at math, right? Or so on and so forth. But look, in terms of kind of the raw IQ, right, we do have to give credence here to Ada Lovelace, who's credited for really founding computer science.
Yeah.
But however, with that said, I think in terms of some of the roles that women have traditionally taken on, such as, being mothers, being caretakers, right, really being that community network node, I do find maybe as a trend, right, among women leaders that I've led as compared to male leaders that I've led, yeah, that they in fact are better at bringing people together and being more empathetic to different types of people on their teams, which I mean, not surprisingly, some of the best leaders that I've had on my teams were women.
Yeah, and of course, there's something we're just fresh from International Women's Day, so these issues are very fresh in my mind. But there's two issues that came up in the we had an event at I Business School. One, of course, is the one that always comes up, which is the failure of women to support other women. I think Madeleine Albright is famous for saying like there's a special place in hell for women who don't support other women. Although Taylor Swift has has also started to use it. And, have women supported you in your career?
I would say yes. And in fact, actually, there's an example, and I spoke about this when I gave the commencement speech at University of Pennsylvania actually last year in May. So it's coming about a year now. Is the reason I ended up at Amazon Web Services was because of a female mentor of mine who happened to be one of the few, women general managers of technology at Amazon. And it was really because of her referral and endorsement that, landed me the role, right? So yes, but with that said, again, if you look at just raw numbers, I have had more male mentors than female mentors simply because if you look around at who are in leadership roles, it still does tend to be men, right? Again, referring back to the challenge that we are seeing and the problem that we need to solve.
Hmm. And would you call out another woman for not supporting women? I mean, do you think if, do the women have the right to do it either way? In other words, or do you, there's always, I mean, it's the sort of the classical question in economics, fight or flight. One thing is to, be supportive when you can. Another thing is to sort of call out bad behavior.
Mhm.
Calling out bad behavior is very difficult,
Yeah.
but
Well, I'll
also,
call anyone out, male or
yeah.
female, right? When, for example, they're shutting down someone in a conference room or not giving someone the platform to speak. One of my favorite sort of questions to ask when I'm in large format meetings is notice, for example, the women in the room who aren't speaking up, right? Who are maybe who haven't provided commentary and say, can those who haven't spoken yet, right, please provide their thoughts on maybe this document or this business plan,
Mhm.
right? Really give voice to those who don't have a voice.
Yeah.
And frankly, that's also part of the reason I'm here on this engagement sponsored by the State Department is I do see it as an obligation that I have, having benefited from the help of so many male as well as female mentors in my career path. Personally, I'm actually very introverted. You may not be able to tell this from this podcast, but I really am. But I feel like because there's so few women in cybersecurity and deep tech, that if I'm not out there, right? That's one less voice championing this mission that we need to hear about.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that there are not many women in. Of course, there's Gwyn in SpaceX being a very visible example. She came to visit us in IE as well, and she gave a fantastic talk, which a student sort of secretly videoed, with using their phone, and it was a sort of, and it now has like 10 million views or something like that, which is so, but it's really interesting, what an example she was, and she talked about, she was asked the question and she was very happy to answer it. And she sort of had that kind of, it didn't really come up sort of thing that when you're on a hard mission, she said that like her biggest sort of advice was always work on hard problems. You know, if you and I were marooned on an island or something, you know, your gender would be of no interest. We would both have to work together to try and get off the island, you know? So her advice was kind of like, if you're working on a hard problem, those kind of issues don't come up. And very often she said when there are tensions between either people who believe that you know that I don't know, people have very strange belief it's just that the mission isn't there in the first place. Mm.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I think in a lot of fields where, and this is why I think tech gives so much opportunity for, maybe marginalized groups or minority groups such as women and LGBT, as we mentioned, is that because it's growing so quickly, right? Before the recording, we talked about OpenAI. All of these AI companies are now, massively requiring technical talent, right? So it won't matter if you are female, male, non-binary, or however you identify yourself if you have the talent that they need, right, there's an opportunity. Likewise, right, in my own career, I've also decided to pick infrastructure and security as fields that I've really dove into, right? When you're working with a team over the weekend through nights to build $1 billion business within AWS in the field of data protection and storage infrastructure, yes, right, there's not a lot of time to think about, well, you are different from me because of these ways, I'm different from you because of these ways. Well, we are working together to your
Yeah.
point, to solve a very hard problem. And that is actually why I want to champion tech as a field that has a lot of opportunity for minority groups because it's really about meritocratic, values as well as having the right skills, less about how you identify yourself.
Sure. One thing I was in China last year, and it was very evident to me. And I guess in preparing for my visit, there's a speech by Jack Ma, and it basically says hire women. That's basically, I don't know whether you've seen that or not, but like Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu, perhaps not as much, but particularly in Alibaba and Tencent, you know, there are women in very visible women in the senior management roles. Do you have any sort of theory as to why that is, or is it just they did their job, they got promoted?
Yeah, I think it goes back to places of a it's really the supply demand curve, frankly, right?
Yeah.
Using based something that, we both learned from business school. If the supply of specific talent that you need is low compared to the demand for that talent, well, that's where I think the equity or the balance of equity is going to be the highest, right? So if you think about, for example, markets like China where it might be more closed, right? And they still, however, right, if you think about companies like Alibaba, Tencent, so on and so forth, they still have massive audiences that they need to serve, right? Similar with, for example, US-based companies like Google, Amazon, Meta, so on and so forth. And if they're looking for a talent within a very specific geographic pool, well, then that's where, again, right, the supply meeting the demand, that curve works out in their favor.
Do you worry about just the ethics of AI and those, because of course the models that they're based on are biased inherently. Do you think that like you have to correct for those, or what's your attitude towards that?
Yeah. So if you hear about, your model is really as only as good as your data,
Yeah.
right? So that's where going back to now my roots as an investor, why we look for example, deep technical moats in companies or startups that we like to back,
Hmm.
right? Which is, well, are you something like maybe a Jasper AI where you can take text and write social media posts for you? Or are you something deeper where you can take a prompt, but you're generating maybe multimodal expressions or entire end-to-end business workflow, right? Which is the latter for of what we look for, right? So to your point around, ethics of AI, it really depends on the data that we're using to train some of these models. So in a recent conversation that I had with a friend of mine who's now running a multi-hundred million valued company in the public safety space, right? Their goal is really to take all of the data that's being generated by traffic cameras, by, the body cameras worn by police officers, and taking that data, analyzing that data, and supplying public safety departments with the outtakes, the insights, or the actionable sort of takeaways or recommendations from that data. Well, look, I mean, one obvious challenge is if that data taken off of cameras or traffic cameras or sensors is not equitable. right? Whether that's for certain populations, certain cities, or people of a certain maybe skin color, right? Well, it's going to be a no-brainer that the recommendations, right, will not also be equitable. And so that's actually a challenge that, I commend him as a CEO for looking out for. And it's actually one of the problem sets that, I'm excited to solve with him.
It's very difficult because, in Europe, um, they're in Europe where for sort of like American companies, make more money in Europe than they do in the US. They tease Europeans, but they actually use a lot of our talent. I mean, a lot of the OpenAI talent is European, people from Poland and people who had very hard technical background growing up. And we never want to be like uncool, but we were sort of thinking, you guys come over and you make all the money, and in some cases you affect our political systems, and you ferment right wing politics and things like that. And I don't, it was sort of awkward. I was starting kind of to push him on this. You could see like the people in the audience kind of thinking, this is a guest in our institution, and you can't be rude to him. But there was. I think we've learned a lot from what happened with the Facebook and the power of these very large models. But we're still reluctant to regulate anything. So and the argument is often that I think where we are now, we've just passed the AI Act in Europe, and the biggest thing that's said is everyone's in favor of regulation, but we don't have regulators. In other words, that people are not just not qualified. I mean, even the people who are designing these systems, don't know enough about them. So, I mean, what's your attitude to kind of to Europe? In terms of there's often a sort of a thing that you regulate in Europe, and then you innovate in the US, and then you make the money
Yeah.
somewhere else.
So look, I think a perfect example of a regulation in Europe that has now spawned, frankly, $1 trillion industry is GDPR,
Yeah.
right? So if we look at just the power of GDPR that has now been replicated in North America, US, Mexico, as well as countries
Hmm.
that I've spoken to in Asia Pacific as well, right? Now you see this proliferation of data protection, data security companies that are helping Fortune 500 companies or government agencies stay compliant with GDPR, data privacy, data, sovereignty laws. So in that same vein, right? First off, I think, coming from more of a capitalistic view, I think competition is going to be really good at advancing the charter of AI and ethics. Because if you think about, what companies are at play, right? I'm not going to name all of them, don't have enough time, but obviously OpenAI.
There's really only
Right?
four of them. Out
Exactly.
there,
Right.
everyone else is on top. Will build on top of those, but there's really
Exactly.
a four.
But if you think about like also Anthropic,
Oh,
right,
yeah.
which his mission is to become the more ethical, right, AI model,
Yeah.
right, as compared to maybe OpenAI, where the
Sure.
founders came from. Also Mistral, right,
Yeah. Yeah.
and also the proliferation. To your point, yes, there's four major companies, but now there's also this concept of smaller language models, or everyone with their own private models, right.
Yeah.
In fact, we invest in a company called Xylon or Private GPT that enables customers to do just that. So if you think about all of this competition, well, then having fair, equitable data feeding into your models becomes a real thing because it could become an angle in which these companies compete for business, right? Especially if that is now regulated or demanded by regulators with some penalty if you don't meet that. I think number two is we can see examples, and there's another actually woman founder of a company called Credo.ai, where she's been invited to the White House to speak with, President Biden and Kamala Harris on the AI Bill of Rights, right? And so, how do you promote better AI guardrails? How do you, for example, now there's a whole, I would say 50 different startups now have met in this category around LLM privacy and governance and security,
Hmm.
right? Which is how do you monitor the data that's coming in, right, in real time? And how do you also monitor and govern the data outputs, maybe the information that you're also releasing from the model, right? Is that safe? Is that private? How can you guarantee that? And how do you now, getting more into the data side, provide certifiable guarantees on the data sets that you're using to train some of these models?
Yeah. I mean, it's a super interesting question, but it's hard to get people still to come out and say like. In Sam's case, he would 1 minute he'd say like I'm for regulation, and then the next minute he was like don't get in the way of innovation. It's almost like it's like it's a really difficult kind of a situation. And as you say, I'm on the entrepreneur side, allow people to innovate, but then the point that's made, the anti-entrepreneur point, is that you have four big models, and these people, if there's a lot of regulation, then they will have the resources to basically deal with the regulation, and that they will, that entrepreneurs won't be able to compete against them. That's the problem, right?
Yeah, I mean that is a, I would say, issue. But with that said, that's where, for example, the stance that companies like Amazon took, which is there's not really one model, right? There's going to be a plethora of models. And now, especially in the area that I focus on, which is the data infrastructure piece of AI, right? How do you build RAG workflows? How do you enable enterprises to build enterprise knowledge base, right? Knowledge searches enabled by all of these maybe PDFs or images or unstructured data that they might have within their environment, right? All of these platforms now give customers the choice to select not only their data sets that they want, for example, vectorized into these RAG workflows, but rather, right, the model that they want to run this data on top of. And so giving that choice again goes back to kind of our earlier point of discussion, which is how do you make this ethics part, this privacy, the security part a core table stakes, right? So it's simply like, for example, running workloads on public clouds like AWS, Azure, GCP, right? We take, privacy, security as table stakes. You would not run your workloads on any of these clouds if it was not a core part of your tenant, right, or your mission statement. So similarly, right, you should not run your data and any model that does not include privacy, ethics, right, safety as part of their core value proposition.
Because it tends to get name checked a lot, and because they sort of have maybe an open source kind of a thing. So I'm sort of curious to say, like, why you think that they're an important company.
Yeah, look, I mean, from a venture capitalist view, right, competition is good because it, frankly, makes the current incumbents much more innovative in their approach. And from a Mistral perspective, I think along the theme of, privatized models, right, open source privatized models, it really gives, the larger players, like we just talked about, a run for their money in terms of how do you better serve end customers, right? Frankly, a colleague of mine actually described this well in his latest blog post, which is, ending of software as a service, but rather service as software,
Yeah.
right? So how do you actually build more customized experiences, personalized experiences based on your end user? And AI really helps us do that, not just, from how we think about personalized healthcare, but also now increasingly, how do we even think about software development, right? AI writing software. And I think that's going to be the next stage that I'm super excited about.
Yeah, and just a quick comment on the other ones, on Anthropic. I mean, I guess they're kind of part of Amazon, right? Kind of. Like they eventually will be, maybe even.
Well, we shall see about that. A lot of friends of mine, actually former colleagues at AWS, are VP of AI Swami and Matt Wood certainly have a lot of thoughts about that. But with that said, look, actually, quite a few of my former colleagues from AWS are now leading engineering efforts at Anthropic, and I think what they've done with Claude 3, their latest release, is very cool.
Yeah.
And certainly, I'm sure you've read up about their capabilities, their number of tokens, context windows. Yeah.
Yeah, there's with Claude, there's much more of a wow moment. Maybe people are coming in with low expectations because Sam takes all the headlines, right? But then there's some of the things that Claude is able to do. People have been really kind of. I got a lot of messages like we should be taking a better look, a stronger look at this. So it is quite interesting. And again, they're kind of, and then the thing that's happening in Microsoft, which is amazing, they now seem to have like an open AI, and then they made like Sullivan came in now as head of their product. So they seem to have like two teams within a company. I mean, that whole thing is like, if someone was asking me to organize an event on AI, and I said, look, so much happens in a week. I literally couldn't tell you what we should be talking about in a month.
Yeah.
Can you make any sense of it?
And I mean, the Microsoft thing is actually very interesting to watch, again, as an outsider, right? Because I've never worked at Microsoft. In fact, actually, one of my good friends, Dom DeVacuner in Seattle, you might want to have him on his show, was the first product manager for OpenAI at Microsoft. So
Right.
he's the one who figured out, okay, how should we think about this partnership? How do we create a private Azure instance of OpenAI? And of course, now their new CEO is also a venture partner at Greylock, which is another firm based
Yeah.
out of Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
who also is on the board of Inflection AI, which is Reid Hoffman's company. So there's so much, I would say, inter networking, right? If you think about the big players to the VC firms to the startups, it's really one giant ecosystem. I think where, I'm truly excited about is really the infrastructure layer that's going to power a lot of these innovations. So companies like, for example, LangChain, Llama Index, enabling companies to build, better and faster, more performant RAG workflows, which actually brings up the question, as foundation models get better, do we even need RAG? Right. So there's so many questions. I mean, now I feel like if I publish a blog on, hey, here's how, for example, you enable search, right? Is that still going to be the way that search is done, right, within an enterprise in the next 6 months? I mean, we truly don't know.
Yeah, I've actually there is another professor who's actually left to start his own company. He has an AI company, and he wrote a blog saying, we're going to play smart. In other words, he's sort of going to wait for all this chaos to kind of sort itself out, which was an interesting sort of approach. And he has Silicon Valley investors kind of behind him, and actually he got it's sort of an interesting by playing hard to get by saying like we're not taking any money, we're just going to sort of assemble a team and kind of wait to pounce, when we see something. Like he got more offers of money, so it's the old thing about saying if you want if you want money, ask for advice, and if you want advice,
That's so great,
ask for
actually.
money.
The best founders, frankly, and I, work for Felicis Venture, which is another VC firm based out of Silicon Valley, resting out of our ninth fund now, $825 million. We've had the pleasure of betting on founders from Weights and Biases, for example, again in the ML infra space, Predabase, which now serves LLM models, MotherDuck, which is another popular, database flavor, right, that's used in AI development, so on and so forth. Some of the best founders that we worked for actually were relationships that we've developed over months, maybe over years, right? So when you think about sort of cold pitching, right, a lot of these founders now, especially in AI, have the opportunity and frankly the good fortune that they don't have to pitch, right? I feel like especially now with, anything that is tagged Gen AI or AI, you automatically have a at least 50% boost in your valuation. And anyone and everyone from different verticals like healthcare, even security, where I'm better worse, right, are saying, okay, we're an AI company.
Yeah. But yeah, anything that grows by 50% can also fall by 50%, like in an equivalent amount of
Yes.
time. That's always the danger. I mean, I study how to scale companies. So, I end up reading a lot of scientific papers about like how organisms grow, like how to like if you overfeed a fish, if you're growing fish in a fish farm and you overfeed the fish, you can make it grow faster, but you also make it more vulnerable to disease. And as companies are simpler like that as well, that if you overfeed them and make them kind of artificially grow stronger than their rate, it makes them vulnerable to like one thing going wrong to kind of bring the whole thing down. It's yeah, it's one of those things like every time you see it, like I'm like, where's the surprise? Anyone who has studied this kind of thing before should expect that to happen. So
Yeah, I mean, you call it a good point, if I might just comment on that, which is, actually before Amazon, I had the pleasure of working at a company called Rubrik. So again, going back to my storage and data days, where Rubrik at the time was one of the fastest growing enterprise software unicorns in the valley. And now it's a global company on the precipice of IPO, says all of my investment banker friends. Right. So, working at an organization like that, where, we just raised our Series C, we'd gone from just a little over 100 people in the R&D, sort of engineering product departments, right? And we were rapidly scaling because the market just had immense pull for the product that we were building, right? We're going from on-premises data centers into now protecting workloads in public clouds, creating a SaaS product, so on and so forth. Right. And there, I think our CEO, Bipul Sinha, was very smart about how to really build well structured teams, right? Where as you scale and as you rapidly deploy and build and iterate for your growing customer base, right? How do you make sure that your structure, right, your employee structure stays sound?
yeah.
And so that's why if you look at a lot of the leadership ranks at Rubrik, many of them have been with him since day one of the company. And that really speaks to, I think, CEO vision, but also a sort of maniacal focus. He calls it relentless focus
Yeah.
on organization culture, right? And that dynamics that you need to pay attention to.
Yeah, I mean, it's the whole thing about one of the things about is there's a saying actually is the guy behind the name will come to me in a second that it's only when you work out how to run a 150-person company, you suddenly then need to learn how to run a 300-person company, which are kind of different skills because you have things like the Dunbar number kicking in of like how many relationships you can have with people. Jensen in NVIDIA says he has 84 direct reports.
Yeah, he doesn't believe in one-on-ones,
Yeah,
supposedly.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, he's suddenly the new star. It's talking about like a guy nobody was talking about for years, and now he's like people can't get enough of him.
Yes, he was like celebrity status. I saw pictures because I was here, and my friends were at the GDC conference.
Yes.
Yes, packed out stadium. It was like he was Beyonce.
No, and
Yeah.
his front row, you had, like Michael Dell, and like like it was really like it was sort of the hottest ticket in town. To get name checked by Jensen in his speech is like the new you've made it in life kind of thing.
Exactly. For academics, it's probably equivalent to your H index.
Well, he's
Okay.
he's
Yeah.
incredibly respectful of academics, which
Mhm.
is nice because people are not. I mean, I've started 6 companies, so I sort of found my way to this afterwards. But he's incredibly respectful of academics, and people do ask me for advice, and one of the things I say is like be a manager of talent. It seems a very obvious thing to do, but with brilliant people, your job is just not to allow things get in their way. And it seems a very like management 101 kind of thing, but people forget.
But
Like,
it's hard to do. That goes back into management styles. Are you a lead from the front kind of person?
yeah,
Or are you lead from the back kind of person? Right. And certainly seems like his leadership style of leading from the back, enabling and supporting his people
yeah.
has worked out really well for him.
Yeah, no, eventually, but he was prepared to pay the long game. But I mean, one of the things is that I would like to call a lot more of my classes like managing, but people always want to take classes that have the word leadership in them. And they kind of go like, well, the first thing is I often start all my classes by saying the first thing is I brought you in here on false pretenses. This class is about management, but if I called
Yes.
it management, none of you would be here because everyone thinks of being a leader. Like it's great to be Shackleton and rescue people from the South Pole. But the better thing is not to get into that situation in the first place. Where
Exactly.
those kind of skills are. Boring management is sort of back. And he was prepared to do the compounding thing. If I get the right people and I set the hard task and then I kind of clear them out, that the right thing will turn up. And when the exponential effect kicks in, we will just be like impossible to compete against.
Yeah, and I agree with you. I think management and leadership are two very different things. In fact, actually, I've talked people out of being managers and I've talked people out of being leaders because, I feel like in many corporate environments, right, you measure seniority by, oh, I have 200 people reporting to me or I have 1,000 people reporting to
Yeah.
me. But frankly, some of the best leaders I have seen in my tenure are technical leaders, maybe distinguished engineers or
Mm,
principal engineers who have nobody reporting to them,
yeah.
but they're able to create such an impact on the technical side that truly it's more so than if you had 200 or 1,000 person org. And this is where recognizing your strengths as an empathetic people leader versus a technical leader versus a process leader is really important because you won't thrive unless you're in the right environment.
Yeah, the worst thing you can do with a brilliant technical person is make them manage a team. It's really.
And I've seen that, and that's the people I talk out of being managers.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's excellent. Sadly, we're out of time, but I do want to finish always with like a recommendation of something. First of all, there's where can I get more Nancy Wang if I want more Nancy Wang?
Come visit me in the Silicon Valley. I will put up a startup showcase for you.
Okay, and
Yes.
that is also a reciprocal invitation to come to Madrid. But is there any kind of book or documentary or anything you would like to recommend that because I always hear of stuff I haven't heard of before.
Yeah, well, if I might cheat, I'll give you two.
Yes.
So, one is we were talking early on about growth and scaling.
Mm,
And one of the books that's really been tremendous, as for example, when I thought about scaling challenges at Rubrik, and then, of course, later on at AWS, when I was given the charter of launching the first managed data protection service and building it into 100 or $1 billion service within 5 years, right? I really found myself going back and back again to this book called High Growth Handbook.
yeah.
Probably heard of it, written
Yeah,
by
it's available for free also
yes,
on the internet.
exactly.
So it's
So you can download it, accessible to everyone. Yeah, Elad Gil, great investor now, early PM at Twitter and Google. Um, so highly recommend that book. I've gone to a lot of talks that he's given on the book and how to think
yeah.
about different scenarios. The second book, which I think is really important for folks who are in general management roles with P&L responsibility or thinking about being future CEOs, is Frank Slootman's book, Amp It Up. So really great read.
He's a bit of
Talks
a
about
controversial character, but yeah,
I know, and of course, the person who took over his role as
yeah,
CEO of Snowflake
yeah.
is another venture partner at Greylock. So
Okay.
I think the firm's been having a heyday lately. But yes, so
Frank
talking,
Frank isn't
yeah,
into. I don't feel like coming in today. I'm a bit sick. Get your ass in here fast. But yeah, he's one of the old guys. One of the
yes,
shows you like the us gray hair guys, or we still
exactly,
have something to give.
and comes from the data protection space. So
Mm.
yes,
Yeah, no, those are two great recommendations. I wouldn't buy a share of Snowflake. I think their price is kind of difficult to justify. But I think Frank Subin is a very interesting character, and I think that a lot of the kind of stuff that he was criticized for, people will be like erasing things they said on podcasts and blogs because it is resilience is back and all that kind of stuff. So it's been fascinating talking to you, Nancy. We moved through a lot of interesting topics, but I hope that the listeners will find that all interesting. Thank you so much for being here, for coming to Porto Alegre, and hope to see you in Madrid sometime. And if I am in Silicon Valley, I will swing by. So thank you
please
so much, Nancy.
come visit us on Sand Hill. We'd love to host you for lunch.
Okay. This is Professor Joe Haslam again, just signing off to thank you for listening to the podcast. They're available on Amazon, they're available on Spotify, they're available on Apple, and they're available on iVoox. Please talk to your friends about them. Tell us what you liked and recommend them. We want to get these ideas spread, and they're a very important part of the community we're trying to build here at IE University. So thank you for listening to Venture Ahead.